soldiers who returned home after war and found their identities stolen. Hey guys, tonight we're sliding gently into one of history's strangest little nightmares. So go ahead, dim the lights, find your comfiest pillow, maybe pretend you're a 15th century peasant for a moment, minus the plagues and terrible dental hygiene, and let's drift into a world where coming home from war wasn't the happy ending you'd hoped for. Because sometimes, soldiers wandered back after years abroad, only to discover that someone else had already taken their place. Their name. Their property. Their spouse. Their entire existence. And society, in its usual calm and rational manner, absolutely refused to believe the real person standing in front of them. Because humans have always been great at handling nuance. Obviously. So let's get cozy and glide into this gently chaotic historical situation, the soldier who comes home, and finds another version of himself already unpacked, settled, and occasionally sleeping in his bed. We're starting tonight with one of the most famous identity theft cases that slipped quietly through medieval Europe like a badly written soap opera plotline that somehow everyone accepted as normal. This is the story of Martin Guerre, the original, I came home and someone stole my life, guy. Let's float into it. So. Picture 16th century rural France. A calm little village, the kind where everyone knows everyone else's business, everyone knows who's sleeping where, and the neighbors have probably named your livestock before you have. It's a gentle place. Simple. Slow. A bit boring. Perfect for tonight's sleepy vibe. In this little world, we meet a young man named Martin. Martin Guerre. A fairly average name for a fairly average guy, which already sets him up perfectly to be impersonated later. If he had been named something spicier, like Jean-Claude Thunderblade, this whole story might not have happened. But no. He was Martin. Just Martin. Martin grew up in the small village of Artigat, nothing fancy, just fields, houses, some animals wandering around pretending to contribute to the economy. He married a young woman named Bertrand de Rolls when he was still basically a teen. They were both awkward, quiet, and not especially thrilled about their arranged marriage. You know, typical 16th century romance. Now, Martin and Bertrand spent the first years of their marriage barely talking and struggling to, well, produce an heir. Which back then was basically the entire job description for a married couple. People whispered about them. Priests whispered. Cows probably whispered. Eventually, though, several years later, they managed to have a child, which finally got the village gossip mill to ease off for a minute. But Martin? Well, he was not exactly thriving emotionally. The man had the vibe of someone who would stare thoughtfully at a loaf of bread for an hour. He was unhappy, restless, probably tired of being judged by relatives who didn't have the vocabulary for, leave me alone. And one day, after a particularly tense argument involving stolen grain, because yes, apparently grain theft was the breaking point, Martin did what men in confused historical marriages often did. He left. Just walked out of Artigat. Gone. No forwarding address. No BRB. Just vanished into the medieval void. And honestly, everyone assumed he was dead. The 16th century had a similar vibe to old fantasy RPGs. If someone left town, there was like a 70% chance wolves or bandits or dysentery got them. But Bertrand? She waited. And waited. And waited. For 8 years. Now, 8 years is long enough for most people to get over a breakup, even in a time before self-help books and sad playlists. But not Bertrand. She remained weirdly loyal to her missing husband, maintaining that he was still alive somewhere, possibly sulking professionally in a distant land. And then, one day, a man walked into the village. He said he was Martin. He looked like Martin. He talked like Martin. He knew Martin's family history, his memories, his marriage, his habits. And Bertrand, after the initial shock, welcomed him home. The villagers welcomed him. His family welcomed him. Even the livestock probably felt mildly relieved. This new Martin slid into the life of the old Martin so smoothly it was almost suspicious. Well, actually, it was suspicious, but apparently no one felt like dealing with that. For several years, everything was peaceful. The couple had more children. Martin managed the farm with way more competence than the original one ever had. Everyone agreed that he was a dramatically improved version of his earlier self. A patch update, if you will. But of course, peaceful stretches make medieval people nervous, so eventually someone decided to stir the pot. Enter, Martin's uncle Pierre. A man described by historians with words like shrewd, calculating, and definitely the type who would start drama at a family wedding. Pierre began to suspect that this new Martin wasn't actually Martin at all. His reasoning? Essentially, this man is too nice. Too responsible. Too competent. This cannot possibly be the same nephew I knew. Which, honestly feels valid. Pierre started whispering rumors around the village like a bored ant with nothing better to do. People began looking at new Martin differently. Was he really the man they remembered? Did he talk with the same accent? Walk the same way? Have the same personality flaws? And slowly, suspicion began to build. Now, you might think Bertrand, actual wife, would know her own husband best. But she insisted he was Martin. Either because she truly believed it. Or because she preferred the upgraded version and was making an executive decision. But eventually, the case grew big enough to go to court. Yes, court. Because apparently the 16th century had a legal process for, is this my husband or a random stranger pretending to be my husband? And it only gets messier. The man posing as Martin Guerre was named Arnaud Dutil, and he played the role extremely well. At the trial, he answered questions about Martin's childhood, his extended family, old arguments, old memories, everything. He was basically the medieval equivalent of someone who binged your entire social media history before trying to impersonate you. The judges were impressed. The villagers were divided. Bertrand was emotional. Pierre was probably in the corner glaring at everyone. And then, because history loves a dramatic entrance at the most inconvenient moment, the actual Martin Guerre walked into the courtroom. Yes. Wooden leg and all. Because he'd lost it fighting in Spain, which is, let's be honest, the most war is awful detail imaginable. Imagine being Arnaud, confidently pretending to be someone, when the actual someone just strolls in mid-performance. Nightmare fuel. The courtroom gasped. Bertrand fainted, apparently. The judges stared like their brains had stopped buffering. And Arnaud Dutil? He admitted everything. He had studied Martin's life from stories told by soldiers on the road, memorized details, and decided that impersonating a missing man in a quiet village was a great life plan. It was not. Arnaud was executed. Martin forgave his wife, which feels generous considering she had technically lived with and had children with another man for years. But Martin wasn't exactly in a position to judge, he had, after all, abandoned his family first. And Bertrand? She insisted she had been deceived. Most historians today think she actually knew, or at least suspected, but preferred a kind, loving husband over the real moody one. Which honestly, is relatable on some level. Now, as odd and cinematic as this story is, it wasn't a one-off. Identity theft was surprisingly common before centralized records, photography, fingerprints, paperwork, modern things. It was a perfect storm. Soldiers disappeared for years. Letters didn't always arrive. Wars chewed men up and spit out a handful. Many never returned. Villages weren't exactly keeping biometric ID on file. So the Martin Guerre situation happened more often than people realize. Some impersonators were harmless opportunists. Some were criminals hiding from charges. Some were distant cousins hoping for an inheritance. And some, simply slipped into empty roles society had left unattended. History didn't keep files on most of them, because identity mix-ups were considered mundane, like losing a goat or misplacing your third child. But a few cases did make it into records. And since we're floating gently through stories tonight, we'll drift to one more, a little quieter, a little sadder, and beautifully sleepy in that classic, European life was weird, kind of way. Before we get into it, let's take a slow breath, because we're about to float from the French countryside to the colder edges of Central Europe, where another soldier, another identity, and another small town were about to collide. A man named Michael, who returned home after years of military service, only to find another man living in his house, wearing his clothes, and claiming to be him. But we'll glide into his life next. Alright, let's drift back in. When we left off, we were floating away from the warm farmlands of France and gently sliding eastward, into a quieter, colder part of early modern Europe. The sort of place where the winters were long, the roofs were low, and the firewood never quite felt dry enough. Perfect, really, for a sleepy story that moves slowly, like fresh snow sliding off the roof of a cottage. Here, somewhere in a small village tucked into the edges of Central Europe, records vary a bit depending on which historian squinted at them the hardest, we meet a man named Michael. Just Michael. Because medieval Europe didn't like giving people exciting names. If you weren't royalty, you got whatever the village priest could spell without crying. So, Michael grew up like many boys in that region. He worked the fields. Occasionally herded animals that weren't listening. Tried extremely hard not to freeze to death in January. And eventually got swept into one of those endless continental conflicts people were always having. It wasn't glamorous. Medieval warfare was never glamorous. Mostly just hungry men walking in circles until someone yelled. Michael served for several years. Maybe he left voluntarily, maybe he was conscripted, maybe his lord insisted, maybe he was simply the first man the soldiers grabbed when passing through town. Historical recruitment tactics were always refreshingly chaotic. What we do know is, he left home. Then war did what war always does, it stretched time, distance, and memory until everything blurred together. And the people back home? They assumed the standard outcome. That Michael wasn't coming back. Because statistically, most didn't. Now, after years of marching, fighting, surviving, and probably eating food unfit for even the most determined goat, Michael eventually did the unthinkable. He came home. He walked back into his village, thinner, older, and carrying the quiet, heavy expression of someone who has seen far too many campfires and not enough stability. He expected a reunion. Maybe a tearful hug. Or at least someone to say, "Wow, didn't expect you to make it back." But instead, everyone looked at him strangely. Not scared. Not excited. Just confused. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and someone stares at you like you're wearing someone else's shoes? Multiply that by 30 suspicious villagers and a handful of chickens, and you get the idea. A man stepped out of Michael's own house. A man wearing Michael's coat. A man holding Michael's axe. A man whose face said, "Yes, hello, I am absolutely Michael, thank you for your concern." And the villagers nodded along with him. Which isn't ideal. Michael stared at the man. The man stared back. And somewhere, a goat probably bleated in dramatic solidarity. Michael insisted he was the real one. The impostor insisted he was the real one. The villagers, who had all quietly reached the point of, "we refuse to deal with difficult things," shrugged and figured the new guy must be telling the truth. After all, he'd been there for years. He knew Michael's belongings. He slept in Michael's bed. He remembered certain details. And, most importantly, he had become a part of village life again. Whereas the real Michael, well, he looked older and more worn down than their memory of him. And you know how people are. If someone doesn't match the old mental picture perfectly, they panic slightly and decide the world is wrong. The impostor wove a believable story. He talked about Michael's youth, his work, his neighbors. He had answers for every question. He confidently walked around the house pointing at things, saying, "Yes, this is where I keep my things," and villagers nodded like helpful background characters. Where did he get this knowledge? Most likely from conversations, gossip, and the simple fact that in a village of maybe 150 people, everyone knew everyone else's life down to the exact place their grandmother kept her onions. Identity theft was shockingly easy back then. There were no IDs. No papers. No photos. Just vibes and rumors. Now, you might expect Michael to storm into the house and reclaim everything loudly, but he didn't. War exhausts people. He was tired. Confused. Hungry. And the village's collective skepticism felt like walking into a cold wind headfirst. He asked for help. The village elder shrugged. The neighbors muttered. A few elderly women squinted at him like he was a slightly disappointing loaf of bread. His wife, or the woman he had been married to before leaving, also stared at him with heartbreaking uncertainty. She had remarried, to the impostor. And she insisted the new husband was the real Michael. Or maybe she didn't want the upheaval. Or maybe she preferred the man who kept the farm running in Michael's absence. Or maybe she simply couldn't emotionally process the idea that her first husband had returned from the dead like a confused ghost with paperwork. Whatever her reasoning, she sided with the impostor. And just like that, the real Michael found himself labeled the stranger. Now, in a slightly more functional society, someone might have said, perhaps we should investigate this. But medieval villages were not known for investigative rigor. So Michael wandered from house to house, explaining his story, begging people to remember him, and slowly realizing that memories fade faster than the people who lived them. Eventually, after months of struggling to reclaim his life through social persuasion, because legal systems were slow and often useless, Michael appealed to the regional court. Imagine trying to prove you're you, without documents, to someone who has never met you. All while the impostor confidently asserts that you're the fraud. It was a philosophical mess. The court listened. Witnesses were brought in. People argued. The impostor maintained his role with the confidence of someone who had practiced this in the mirror. Some villagers supported Michael. Some supported the new one. Most wanted to go home and eat soup. Eventually, the court demanded something harder to fake. Childhood marks. Old scars. Little details. And slowly, through testimony and physical evidence, it became clear that the weary, poorly dressed soldier who staggered into town truly was the original Michael. And the impostor, well, he had done the medieval equivalent of identity fraud, bigamously married a woman who wasn't technically single, and claimed land he didn't own. A trifecta of unfortunate decisions. The regional court did not take it well. The impostor fled. Or, depending on which dusty source you squint at, he was punished severely. Medieval punishment was rarely subtle. Michael got his house back. His land back. His belongings back. But here's the part that makes this story universally sad. He never really fit in again. The villagers remained awkward around him. His wife, well, her loyalty had shifted. The trust was gone. Their relationship had the warmth of a wet stone. And Michael carried the deepest wound of all. That he had come home hoping for belonging. And found himself treated like a stranger in the place that was supposed to remember him best. In the end, he drifted to the edges of the village, physically and emotionally, living quietly, farming his land, speaking little. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It was simply melancholy. Which, honestly, is very on brand for European history. So after floating through France and Central Europe, let's drift a little further, into a different era, a different climate, and a different flavor of identity confusion. Because as strange as medieval impersonations were, the 19th century, oh yes, had its own version. A quieter, more bureaucratic one. A soldier named Johann, who returned home after years in the Austro-Prussian conflicts, only to find not just an impostor, but paperwork insisting that he was dead. Not ideal. We'll glide to him next. Alright, let's settle back in. Take a slow breath. Let the mind uncrumple a bit. And drift with me into another quiet corner of European history, one wrapped in uniforms, paperwork, and the kind of bureaucratic confusion that feels aggressively sleepy in the best possible way. Because our next story is about a man named Johann, who discovered that sometimes the most dangerous opponent a soldier faces isn't the enemy army. It's the paperwork. So, we're floating now into the mid-19th century. Europe is in that era where everyone is fighting over borders, alliances, and whose mustache style is superior. The Austro-Prussian conflicts are simmering in the background, one part nationalism, one part politics, and about 5 parts ego. Johann was one of thousands swept into this messy stew. Not a heroic general. Not a famous commander. Just a quiet infantryman. The kind of man who could walk past you in a crowd and you'd forget his face immediately. Perfectly ordinary. Perfectly invisible to history, until something strange happened. He lived in a small town tucked into the Austrian countryside, fields of dry grass, wooden houses, the whole "please don't start a war near my farm again" vibe that Central Europe perfected over the centuries. Johann was conscripted, trained, given a uniform that didn't fit quite right, and sent off to whichever muddy field the empire needed warm bodies on. He fought. He marched. He survived things that most men didn't. And after several long years abroad, Johann finally returned home, thin, tired, and carrying that distant, slightly hollow expression soldiers bring back from places where life has been unkind. He expected maybe a hug. A warm meal. A moment to sit by the fire and relearn how to be a person again. Instead, he got something else. Confusion. Suspicion. And a letter, stamped, sealed, and impeccably official, declaring that he had died 3 years earlier. Which is inconvenient. Imagine showing up alive, only to discover the government has already filed the paperwork for your death. In some ways, it feels like you're interrupting your own funeral. Johann stared at the paper. The paper stared back, cold and confident. And the villagers, who had a deep respect for anything with a government stamp, simply shrugged and said, "Well, that's what the report says." Because nothing in history is as unshakable as the authority of a bad document. Johann tried to insist he was alive, demonstrating this by doing helpful things like breathing and talking, but people remained weirdly unconvinced. His landlord had already sold his belongings. His brother had already claimed his share of the family property. His childhood friend was now engaged to his fiancée. And the town priest, flipping through the parish records, said gently, "Yes, I see here we buried you. Very tragic. God rest your soul." Johann waved his arms. He pointed at himself. He asked if ghosts typically left footprints in the snow. But the priest just closed the book with the confidence of a man who trusts paperwork more than the living being standing in front of him. Johann went to the local administrative office, probably a dim little room with a clerk who had been bored since the day he was born, and tried to explain the situation. The clerk listened. Took a slow sip of something unpleasant. And said, "Well, I can file a request to the request office for a request form to be submitted." Which, in bureaucratic language, meant, "We will never fix this." And here's the strange part. People in town began treating Johann like some sort of friendly apparition. Not scary. Not dangerous. Just, a wandering soul with excellent posture. Some avoided him politely, not wanting to disturb the eternal rest he very clearly was not enjoying. One elderly neighbor supposedly asked him to pass along a message to her dead husband, proof that even ghosts aren't safe from errands. Eventually, Johann found himself legally, socially, and economically erased. He had no property. No identity. No rights. No existence, according to the empire. He was a man alive in every physical sense, but dead in every official one. And that is a surprisingly quiet, tragic kind of horror. Now, eventually, after months of paperwork, testimonies, and the local authorities reluctantly admitting that perhaps ghosts do not eat bread, Johann managed to take his case to a regional court. The judge listened, skeptical. "How do you prove you're yourself?" the judge asked, "and not a deserter using a dead man's name?" Ah yes. The eternal question that has haunted history. How do you prove you're you, in an age before documents, photos, fingerprints, or anything remotely helpful? Johann presented his childhood scars. A crooked finger broken in a farming accident. The memory of an old family dispute. And his mother, who mercifully recognized him instantly. Which, honestly, should have been enough for anyone. Eventually, after many testimonies, the court acknowledged the obvious. He was Johann. Very much alive. Deeply annoyed. Probably craving soup. But because bureaucracy must always win, the judge declared. You may reclaim your identity, but not your past. Meaning. The property claimed by his brother. Gone. The belongings sold by his landlord. Gone. The fiancé who moved on. Also gone. The legal death certificate. Still technically valid in the archives. He was alive, yes. But only moving forward, not backward. Johann rebuilt his life slowly. He remarried. He worked odd jobs. He avoided administrative offices like they were plague pits. But the villagers continued whispering. That's Johann, the man who died, but didn't. And in a small town, whispers are forever. Now, before we drift onward, it's worth pausing gently on this recurring theme. Identity, in the pre-modern world, was the most fragile thing a person owned. You could lose it through war, gossip, paperwork, a stranger claiming to be you, or simply being gone longer than people's memories allowed. There wasn't a legal system built for nuance. Just assumptions. And the occasional misplaced coffin inscription. So tonight, as we continue wandering through these ghost-like soldiers, alive, yet erased, we're going to drift next into a different continent entirely. A story from Japan. A soldier who returned home not after years, but after decades. And found his country, his family, his identity, and even his era, had moved on without him. That's our next quiet step in this sleepy journey.